Princess Velara stood in the ceremonial chamber of the orbital station above Earth, her silver skin catching the artificial light in a way that made her glow like a star brought down from the heavens. And she felt nothing but cold emptiness inside her chest as she waited for the human she would call husband. The war between the Ethrani Empire and humanity had raged for 12 years, leaving behind burning worlds and broken families on both sides. And now it was ending not with a final battle, but with a marriage alliance that felt more like a surrender than a celebration. Velara had been chosen for this duty because she was the third daughter of Emperor Chiron, important enough to honor the treaty, but not important enough that her loss would truly matter to the imperial succession. And she understood her role perfectly as she stood there in ceremonial robes that felt like chains around her body. Ethrani Council had told her that her husband would be a minor human diplomat named Cole Harris, a man selected specifically because he held no military rank and posed no threat to the Empire. And they had assured her that she would be the one in control of this arrangement, despite being sent away from her home forever when the doors opened and Cole walked in. Velara studied him with the careful attention her tutors had taught her to use when evaluating potential threats or allies. He was tall for a human, standing just over 6 feet with broad shoulders that suggested physical labor rather than noble birth. And his brown hair was slightly messy, as if he had not bothered to prepare properly for his own wedding ceremony. His green eyes met hers across the room, and she saw something in them that surprised her. A deep tiredness that seemed to go beyond simple exhaustion and touch something closer to the weariness of the soul. He wore simple civilian clothes instead of military dress uniform, which confirmed what the council had told her about his unimportant status. And she felt a mixture of relief and insult that they had given her someone so ordinary. Cole walked toward her with careful steps, moving with a quietness that seemed strange for a man of his size, almost as if he was used to making himself small and unnoticed in crowded spaces. When he reached the ceremonial platform where Velara stood, he offered his hand in the human greeting gesture, and she noticed the rough calluses on his palm and the faded white scar that ran along the inside of his forearm from wrist to elbow. He is probably a farmer or a factory worker, she thought to herself. Someone they dressed up and gave a title just for this occasion so they could claim they honored the treaty without actually giving me anyone of value. The ceremony itself was brief and purely functional, with a human official reading words that meant nothing to Velara and an Ethrani priest performing the binding ritual with obvious reluctance and barely hidden disgust when it was done. Cole signed the documents with a simple signature, while Velara pressed her family seal into the ceremonial wax. And just like that, they were married in the eyes of both civilizations. The Ethrani delegation departed within hours of the ceremony, leaving Velara alone on the human station with a husband she did not know and a future she could not predict. Her father had not come to the wedding, sending only a recorded message that spoke of duty and sacrifice and the greater good of the Empire. And Velara had deleted it without watching more than the first few seconds. That first night, Cole showed her to her quarters, which were separate from his own on the opposite side of their shared living space. And he explained the layout of the station in simple terms that suggested he expected her to have difficulty understanding, showed her where to find food in the communal dining area, how to use the communication system if she needed to contact him or anyone else on the station, and which areas were restricted for security reasons. Velara listened with half her attention while the other half cataloged everything about him, searching for hidden weapons or signs of deception or anything that would tell her what kind of cage she had truly been placed in. She found nothing obvious, only a man who seemed genuinely tired and spoke with a soft voice that held no threat or malice. When the tour was complete, Cole stood in the doorway of her quarters and looked at her with those exhausted green eyes. "I know this is not what you wanted," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he understood exactly how she felt about being treated like property. between warring nations, I will give you as much space as you need. And we can figure out how to make this arrangement work over time. And I promise I will not ask anything of you that you are not willing to give. Valara did not know how to respond to such an offer, as she had expected demands or threats, or at least some attempt to establish dominance over her in this new relationship. You are not what I expected, she finally admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Cole smiled at that, but the expression did not reach his eyes, staying on his lips like a mask he had learned to wear for the comfort of others. I get that a lot, he replied, and something in his tone made Valara think there was a much larger story behind those simple words. He wished her good night and left, closing the door gently behind him. And Valara stood alone in her new quarters, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Room was comfortable by human standards, with a bed that was too soft and air that was too warm and gravity that was slightly stronger than what she was used to on Etherany's ship. She moved to the window and looked out at the stars, trying to find a constellation that would point toward her home world. But everything looked different from this angle, and she could not orient herself in the vast darkness. For the first time since she had been told about this marriage, Valara allowed herself to feel the fear and loneliness that she had been pushing down deep inside her chest. She was a princess of the Ethrani Empire, raised in luxury and trained in politics and diplomacy. And now she was trapped on an alien station, married to a man whose only notable quality seemed to be his complete lack of notable qualities. But something about Cole Harris bothered her in a way she could not explain. Some instinct that whispered there was more to him than the simple farmer or worker. She had assumed him to be calluses on his hands, the scar on his arm, the way he moved so quietly, the exhaustion in his eyes that seemed too deep for a man who had apparently never seen. Comet Valara was trained to notice details, and the details she had noticed did not add up to the story she had been told as she prepared for sleep in this strange new place that was supposed to be her home. She made a decision to watch her husband carefully in the days to come, to learn who he really was behind the gentle words and tired smiles. She did not yet know that the answer to that question would change everything. She believed about humans and about the war that had shaped both their peoples, and she certainly did not suspect that the quiet man who had shown her to her quarters with such careful politeness was the most dangerous being she had ever stood beside. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding, and Valara had begun to settle into a routine on the human station that orbited high above the blue and green world they called Earth. She spent her mornings learning the human language with greater depth than her basic training had provided, picking up the subtle meanings behind their words and the strange idioms they used in everyday conversation. The afternoons she devoted to exploring the station itself, mapping its corridors and common areas in her mind, the way she had been taught to map any unfamiliar territory. During her diplomatic training back home, Cole gave her complete freedom to go wherever she wished, and she found herself grateful for that, even as she remained suspicious of his motives for being so generous. It was during these explorations that Valara first noticed something strange about the way humans treated her husband. She was walking through one of the main corridors near the engineering section when she saw Cole approaching from the opposite direction, and she paused to observe how the humans around him reacted to his presence. A group of engineers who had been laughing and talking loudly suddenly fell silent as he passed, their conversations dying in their throats as if someone had stolen their voices. Two officers who had been walking with casual confidence straightened their spines and nodded at Cole with expressions that looked almost nervous. A young soldier, barely more than a boy in uniform, actually stepped back against the wall to let Cole pass with a look on his face that Valara could only describe as fear mixed with something close to worship. Cole seemed not to notice any of this, walking past them with his head slightly down and his shoulders hunched in that way he had of making himself seem smaller than he really was. But Valara noticed everything. At first she thought the reactions were because of her, because she was the enemy princess and people were uncomfortable being near someone from the civilization they had been fighting for over a decade. But that explanation fell apart when she realized that the humans were not looking at her at all. Their eyes were fixed on Cole, tracking his movement through the corridor the way prey animals might watch a predator that had wandered too close to the herd. Valara began paying closer attention after that day, watching every interaction Cole had with the station inhabitants and cataloging the responses he received. The pattern was consistent and unmistakable. Officers who outranked him on paper treated him with deference that made no sense for a minor diplomat. Enlisted personnel found excuses to salute him, even though his civilian status meant they had no obligation to do so. Even the station administrator, a severe woman named Patricia Reeves, who held the rank of admiral, spoke to Cole with a careful respect that bordered on caution. Valara tried asking questions, approaching the humans she had begun to form acquaintances with during her explorations. The engineer named Danny, who maintained the life support systems, just laughed nervously when she asked about Cole and said he was just Cole, as if that explained anything at all. The doctor who had given her a medical examination when she first arrived became very interested in her data pad when she mentioned her husband and said only that he had been through a lot before changing the subject to questions about Ethrani physiology. One would give her a straight answer, and the more they avoided her questions, the more determined she became to find the truth. The opportunity came when Admiral Reeves invited Valara to have dinner in her private quarters, an invitation that was clearly meant to evaluate the enemy princess who was now living among them. Valara accepted immediately, seeing the chance to speak with someone who had authority and might be willing to reveal what everyone else was hiding. The Admiral's quarters were larger than Valara had expected, decorated with photographs and medals and what looked like pieces of destroyed Ethrani ships mounted on the walls as trophies. They ate synthetic food that the humans called gourmet and drank something the Admiral called wine. And the conversation remained polite and meaningless until Valara decided she had waited long enough. "Who is my husband really?" she asked, setting down her glass and meeting the Admiral's eyes with the direct stare that Ethrani used when demanding truth. Admiral Reeves did not seem surprised by the question, almost as if she had been expecting it from the moment she sent the dinner invitation. She was quiet for a long moment, her weathered face growing serious in a way that made her look suddenly older and more tired. "Your people gave him a name during the war," the Admiral said finally, her voice dropping lower as if she was worried about being overheard even in her own quarters. "Do you remember what the Ethrani called the human commander who broke through the siege of Proxima?" Vela felt her silver blood run cold in her veins as memory stirred in her mind. The siege of Proxima had been one of the great victories of the early war, when Ethrani forces had trapped the human fleet in a system with no escape routes and prepared to destroy them completely. But something had happened that turned the certain victory into a devastating defeat. A single human ship that had done what should have been impossible. "Do you remember?" the Admiral continued. "What they called the one who led the assault on the shipyards at Kethram Prime and destroyed 70% of your production capacity in a single attic?" Valara remembered the stories she had grown up hearing. The name that Ethrani parents whispered to frighten children who would not behave. The legend that had grown around a human who seemed more demon than Mandy Pale Death. She whispered, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. Admiral Reeves nodded slowly, confirming what Valara did not want to believe. "Cole Harris," she said, speaking his name like it was the answer to everything. Like those two simple words contained 12 years of war and death and impossible human survival. 37 confirmed capital ship kills. The Admiral continued, her voice taking on the quality of reciting statistics she had memorized long ago. Architect of the Brennan maneuver that changed fleet combat doctrine for both sides. The man who turned the entire war around when we were 6 months from total defeat and gave humanity a chance to serve. Velar shook her head, unable to reconcile the legend with the quiet man she had been living with. That is impossible, she said, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. He is so quiet, so gentle. He never speaks of battles or glory or anything that would suggest he was a warrior. The quiet ones usually are. The Admiral replied, and something in her eyes suggested she had seen things during the war that still haunted her. Sleep. He requested this assignment himself. You know, she added, watching Valar's face carefully for her reaction, demanded it actually. When the treaty was being negotiated, said that if there was going to be peace, he wanted to be the one to build it with his own hands instead of letting politicians take credit for what soldiers had paid for in blood. The council agreed because they thought it would keep him contained. The Admiral finished, picking up her wine glass again, of sight and out of mind, where he could not remind them of how close we came to losing everything. Valara sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she had just learned. They are afraid of him too, Princess, Admiral Reeves said softly, and there was no mockery in her voice, only simple truth. Everyone is. Valara returned to her quarters that night in a state of shock that made her movements slow and mechanical, like she was walking through water instead of air. She did not sleep at all, lying on her bed and staring at the ceiling while her mind replayed every moment she had spent with Cole since the wedding, the gentle way he spoke to her, the careful distance he maintained to respect her comfort, the tired smile that never quite reached his eyes. None of it matched the monster her people had created legends about. For the next several days she watched him with new eyes, cataloging details she had noticed before but had not understood. She saw how he never sat with his back to a door, always choosing seats that gave him a clear view of every entrance and exit in whatever room he occupied. She noticed how his eyes tracked movement constantly, flicking toward any sudden motion in his peripheral vision with a speed that suggested deeply ingrained reflex rather than conscious choice. She observed how he woke before dawn every single morning without exception, making his way to the observation deck, where he would stand for exactly 1 hour staring out at the stars. One morning, she followed him there, staying in the shadows of the doorway to watch him without being seen. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight but not stiff, and his green eyes reflected the distant light of 1,000 suns burning in the void. She could see his lips moving slightly and realized he was counting. Though what he was counting she could not guess. After exactly 60 minutes, he turned and walked toward the exit, and Valara had to press herself against the wall to avoid being discovered. His face as he passed was the saddest thing she had ever seen on any being of any species, a grief so deep and old that it seemed carved into his very bones. She could not keep her silence any longer after witnessing that private moment of pain. That evening she found him in the small workshop area attached to their shared quarters, where he spent most of his free time repairing devices and building things with his calloused hands. He was working on some kind of mechanical puzzle when she entered, his fingers moving with precise skill as he fitted tiny pieces together. "You are the pale death," she said without preamble, speaking the words in the flat tone of someone stating an undeniable fact. Cole's hands stopped moving, but he did not look up from his work. He replied quietly, his voice carrying the same exhaustion she had heard in it since the day they met. "I do not use that name anymore." Vela stepped closer, her silver skin flushing darker with the Ethrani equivalent of anger. "You killed thousands of my people," she accused him, her voice rising despite her training to remain calm in confrontations. Millions perhaps when you count the ships you destroyed and the stations you burned. Yes, the simple admission stopped her cold. Cole finally looked up at her, meeting her eyes without flinching or looking away. "And your fleets killed billions of mine," he said, his tone not angry, but simply honest in a way that felt like being cut with a very sharp knife. "We both have blood on our hands, Valara. That is what war is. That is what it does to everyone it touches, regardless of which side they fight." For Valara felt her anger surge higher at his apparent lack of remorse. At the casual way, he spoke of such enormous death. "Why did you agree to this marriage then?" she demanded, stepping even closer until she was standing directly over him. Was it revenge? A chance to humiliate an Ethrani princess by making her share a home with the man who slaughtered her people? Cole set down the device he had been working on and rose from his seat, his height putting him several inches above her now that they were standing face to face. His expression was not cold or cruel or triumphant as she had expected. It was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, the weariness of a soul that had carried too much weight for too long. "I agreed because I am tired of killing," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word before he steadied it again. "I am good at war, Valara. Better than anyone should be. Better than I ever wanted to be when I was young and did not understand what fighting really meant." His green eyes held hers without wavering as he continued to speak. "But being good at something does not mean you have to love it. Does not mean you have to keep doing it forever when the cost of that skill is measured in lives destroyed and families broken. I have seen enough death," he said, and his hands clenched at his sides as if he was physically holding something back. "I have caused enough death. I thought maybe if I spent the rest of my life building something instead of destroying things, I might be able to sleep again without seeing their faces." Valara was not sure whose faces he meant, whether he was speaking of the Ethrani he had killed or the humans he had failed to save, or perhaps both at once. "And I thought you deserved better," Cole added, his voice dropping lower as if this part was harder to admit. "Better than what?" she asked, confused by the sudden shift in his explanation. "Better than being handed off to some politician who would use you as a trophy," he said. "Some ambitious man who would parade you around at parties and remind everyone that humans had won the war every time they looked at you. At least with me you would be safe. You would have a choice about how to live your life. You would be left alone if that was what you wanted." Valara did not know how to respond to that. She had spent her entire life in the imperial court where every kindness was calculated. Every gift came with strings attached. Every offer of help was really a demand for something in return. The idea that someone might do something simply because they thought it was right, without expecting anything for themselves, was foreign to her in a way that felt almost threatening. She left the workshop without another word, retreating to her quarters to think about everything she had learned, but she found herself unable to dismiss Cole as easily as she had expected. The monster from the legends would not have cared about her comfort or her choices or her right to be treated as something more than a prize of war. The pale death of Ethrani. Nightmares would not have spent his mornings staring at the stars with grief etched into every line of his face. For the first time since coming to this station, Valara began to wonder if perhaps she had been wrong about humans all along, and that thought frightened her more than anything else she had encountered in her new life among the enemy. 3 months had passed since Valara first confronted Cole about his identity, and in that time something had shifted between them that neither of them had names for. They still maintained separate bedrooms and careful boundaries, but they had begun eating meals together and talking in the evenings about small things that slowly grew into larger conversations. Cole told her about Earth, about the oceans that covered most of its surface and the forests that had once stretched across continents before humans had nearly destroyed them, and then spent generations trying to bring them back. Valara told him about Ethron, about the crystal spires of the capital city, and the 7 moons that filled the night sky with so much light that true darkness was rare and precious. They did not discuss the war or the peace or what either of them had done or suffered during those 12 terrible years. It was a fragile truce built on avoidance. But it was something that felt almost like the beginning of friendship. Then the assassin's camp of Valara was in the station garden when the first explosion shook the walls. A carefully maintained space where humans grew plants to remind themselves of the world below. The lights flickered once, twice, and then switched to the harsh red of emergency mode. Alarms began to scream through the corridors, and Valara could hear distant sounds of weapons fire echoing through the metal halls. She was reaching for the communication device Cole had given her when the garden door burst open, and he was there, moving faster than she had ever seen him move before. He was transformed in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. Gong was the tired gentleman who repaired devices and watched the stars. With sad eyes, in his place was something that moved like liquid death. Every motion precise and economical, and utterly without wasted energy. In his hands was a weapon she did not recognize. Human in design, but modified with components that looked almost Ethron-y in origin, as if someone had taken the best of both civilizations and forged them into a single instrument of destructions. "Stay behind me," he said, and his voice was calm in a way that was more terrifying than any shout or scream. Was the voice of someone who had done this so many times that it no longer raised his heartbeat or quickened his breath before Valara could respond. The first assassin came through the secondary entrance. He was Ethron-y, tall and silver-skinned like her, but with the enhanced musculature that marked him as gene-modified for combat, and he held a plasma blade that hummed with deadly energy. As he charged toward her, Cole shot him twice in the chest before the blade completed its arc. The assassin's body had not yet hit the ground when Cole was already moving, putting himself between Valara and the second attacker who came through the door, half a second behind the first. This one was female, faster than the first, and she managed to fire her weapon before Cole reached her. He twisted his body in a way that seemed impossible for human anatomy, letting the plasma bolt pass within inches of his face. And then he was on her with a speed that blurred in Valara's vision. The fight lasted perhaps 2 seconds. When it ended, the assassin was on the ground with her neck bent at an angle that no living being could survive. More came after that, pouring through both entrances in a coordinated assault that should have overwhelmed any single defender. No matter how skilled, Vela counted 12 attackers in total, the best warriors the Ethron purist faction could field, each one gene-enhanced and trained from birth for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat. Cole killed them like they were moving through thick mud while he moved through open air, used their own momentum against them, redirecting charges into walls and other attackers. He took their weapons from their hands and turned them against their owners before they could register what had happened. Fought with a brutal efficiency that Valara had only ever seen in training simulations designed to show what a perfect warrior would look like if such a thing could exist. But the simulations had always seemed exaggerated, impossible, created to give students something to aspire to, even though no real being could ever move like that. Cole moved like that and made it look almost easy. When the violence finally stopped, 11 bodies lay scattered across the garden that had been designed to represent peace and growth and new beginnings. The 12th assassin was on his knees in front of Cole, disarmed and bleeding from a wound on his shoulder, with Cole's strange weapon pressed against his temple. "Who sent you?" Cole asked, and his voice had not changed at all from that terrible calm The assassin spat something in the old Ethrani tongue. Words that Valara recognized as the most vile insults her language could produce. You think killing us will end this? The assassin snarled, his silver blood dripping down his arm and pooling on the floor beneath him. There will be more. There will always be more. The Empire will never accept this mongrel peace that Shamus, our ancestors, Cole, was silent for a long moment. His weapon still pressed against the assassin's head. And Valara felt certain she was about to witness an execution. Then he lowered the weapon and stepped back. Go back to whoever sent you, Cole said, his voice finally showing something other than calm. Something that sounded almost like disappointment. Tell them what you saw tonight. Tell them every detail of how the pale death is still alive and still capable of doing what I just did to your teen. His green eyes locked onto the assassins with an intensity that made even Valara want to look away. Tell them that if they come for my wife again, I will not stop at assassins. The words hung in the air like a promise written in fire. I will come for their shipyards. Cole continued, his voice dropping lower with each word. I will come for their colonies. I will come for their homeworld. I ended one war, and I can end another. And this time, I will not stop until there is nothing left to threaten her. He gestured toward the door. With his weapon run, the assassin ran, scrambling to his feet and fleeing through the shattered entrance. Without looking back, Cole watched him go, and then the terrible focus drained out of his body all at once. Leaving behind the tired man Valara had come to know, he turned to look at her, and his green eyes were full of something that might have been shame. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice soft again, concerned again. Human again. Valara looked at the bodies around them, at the blood on his hands and clothes, at the weapon that had killed Somei so quickly. She looked at the man who had just demonstrated exactly why an entire civilization had learned to fear his name, and she realized that she was not afraid of him at all. The medical bay was quiet in the hours after the attack, the emergency lights having been replaced by the normal soft glow that humans preferred. For their healing space, Valara sat on an examination table while human doctors treated the minor cuts she had received from flying debris during the fight, their hands gentle and professional as they worked. Cole stood in the corner of the room, having refused treatment for his own injuries until the doctors had seen to Valara first. And he was still wearing the blood of her would-be killers on his clothes and skin. He had not spoken since they left the garden, and his eyes had that distant look that Valara had learned to recognize as the expression he wore when he was somewhere else inside his own mind. The doctors finished their work and excused themselves with quiet words about giving the couple privacy. And then Valara was alone with the man who had just killed 11 elite warriors to protect her. You called me your wife, she said, breaking the silence that had grown heavy between them. Cole blinked and focused on her face as if he was returning from a very long journey. What? He asked, confusion evident in his voice. When you threatened that assassin, Valara continued, watching his expression carefully for any sign of what he was feeling. You said if they come for my wife again, not if they come for the princess, not if they come for the hostage. You said your wife. Cole was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him replaying the conversation in his memory. I suppose I did, he finally admitted. And there was something vulnerable in the way he said it. Valara slid off the examination table and walked across the room to stand in front of him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his tired green eyes. I do not understand you, she said honestly, speaking the words she had been holding inside for months. My people tell stories of the Pale Death as a monster, a demon in human form who destroyed our ships and burned our stations and killed without mercy or hesitation. She gestured at his blood-stained clothes, at the room around them, at everything that had happened. And you did those things tonight. You killed those warriors like they were nothing, like it was easy, like it was as natural as breathing. Cole did not deny it, did not look away. Did not make excuses for what he was capable of, but you are not a monster, Valara continued, and her voice softened. Despite herself, a monster would not have spent months giving me space to adjust to this new life. A monster would not have taught me about Earth, and asked about Ethrin, and listened when I spoke. A monster would not have stood in front of plasma weapons to protect someone from a species he had every reason to hate. Then, what am I? Cole asked, and there was genuine uncertainty in his voice, as if he did not know the answer himself. Valara thought about the question seriously before responding. I think you are a man who was given a terrible gift, she said slowly, the ability to destroy and protect in equal measure. And you spent 12 years using that gift to save your people because there was no other choice. His jaw tightened at her words, but he did not interrupt, and I think the weight of what you did during those years broke something inside you. She continued, I think you carry the faces of everyone you killed, Ethreni and human alike. And you count them every morning when you stand in the observation deck because you believe you owe them that much at least. How did you know about that? Cole asked, surprise cutting through the exhaustion in his eyes. I followed you one morning, Valara admitted. I watched you stand there counting, and I saw the grief on your face, and I did not understand it until now. She reached out and took one of his blood-stained hands in her silver fingers. The first time she had voluntarily touched him since their wedding ceremony. I think you are trying very hard to be something other than what the war made you, she said. I think you agreed to this marriage because you hoped that building peace might help you become the person you want to be instead of the weapon everyone else sees. When they look at you, Cole's hand trembled slightly in her grip, and she saw moisture gathering in the corners of his eyes. I do not know if I can ever be anything else, he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd been holding back for too long. I have killed so many people, Valara. I remember all of their faces. I see them when I close my eyes. I hear them when the station is quiet. They are part of me now, and I do not know how to let them go. Then do not let them go, Valara said, and her own voice was thick with feelings she had not expected to have for this human who had once been her enemy. Carry them with you and use their weight to remind yourself why peace matters, why this treaty matters, why we matter. She squeezed his hand tighter, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life as a warrior. I think I would like to start this marriage over, she said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside her that she had not known existed. I would like to start as two people who might learn to understand each other, not as a hostage and a handler, not as a princess and a weapon, just two people who have both lost too much and are trying to find a way forward. Cole looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted like clouds moving away from the Sunni. Would like that too, he said, and for the first time since she had known him, his smile reached all the way to his eyes. Valara realized she was still holding his hand, and she did not let go. Outside the medical bay windows, the stars burned in the endless dark. Billions of lights scattered across the void that separated the worlds of humans and Ethrenitu. Civilizations that had spent 12 years trying to destroy each other were learning slowly and painfully to coexist, to trade, to speak without weapons in their hands. It would not be easy, and there would be more challenges ahead. More purists who rejected the peace, more politicians who sought advantage, more ghosts from the war that would have to be faced, but in one small room on a station between worlds. Something new was beginning. A princess who had been raised to hate humans had found herself married to the most dangerous one in existence. And instead of the monster she had expected, she had discovered a man who wanted nothing more than to be allowed to put down his weapons and rest. A warrior who had won a war and lost himself in the process, had been given a chance to become something other than a legend, to be seen as a person instead of a name that frightened children. They stood together in the medical bay with blood still drying on Cole's clothes. and hope still fragile in both their hearts. And when Valara finally released his hand, it was only so she could wrap her arms around him in an embrace that he returned with a desperate gentleness that told her everything she needed to know about the lonely years he had spent carrying his burdens alone. This was not the ending of a story, but the beginning of one. And for the first time since she had arrived on the human station, Valara found herself looking forward to discovering what came next. The Pale Death was no more, buried by the man who had worn that name like armor for too long. In his place stood Cole Harris, husband and partner, and something that felt very much like the start of home and dad. Valara thought as she held him close and felt his heartbeat strong and steady against her chest. Was a far better ending to a war than anyone could have hoped for.